Thank you. Okay. There you go. Thank you. Thank you very much. For the last presentation in this session, I'd like to introduce from Concord College.
University.
I'm sorry, Concord University.
Concord College for.
It was, well, never mind. Good friend, old friend of mine, Karen Baranch.
Thank you so much. Sorry to correct you, but we got to, thank you. I've just been named the director of the theater department there, so it's very exciting. All right, thank you very much for both my colleagues' comments. They were very interesting. I'm also going to talk about Pearl Buck as a social activist. By World War II, Pearl Buck was already known throughout America as one of the most influential women. She was the only woman in her lifetime to achieve both the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature. She was joined by Toni Morrison after Pearl Buck's death in that award. I can't read word for word. I do have this professionally written, but she was remarkably popular as a novelist. But perhaps she was equally as well known for her work as a social activist and humanitarian. She was a tireless advocate for children, as we heard from the previous speaker, women's rights, civil rights, Asian issues. But perhaps it was her understanding of race prejudice and the personal experience she had of bigotry that gave her the passion to fight for global understanding of all people, not in the least African Americans of her own nation. In addition, she was a leading proponent for the Free India League to get independence for India from Britain, and she spoke out against Japanese internment during World War II. And after the war, she turned her attention toward the plight of abandoned and orphaned children. She once said, and I quote, "Indeed, with my missionary training, my success as a writer, and my celebrity status, I feel I would be delinquent if I did not work to make my country and my world a better place." Her outspoken crusades brought both praise and unfortunately, it also brought criticism. Eventually, it was that criticism that would cause her to be marginalized in the American experience. Pearl Buck was born in the rural Appalachian community of Hillsborough, West Virginia. However, as many of us have talked today, at just 3 months, her missionary parents took her to China, and she lived there until she was 40, returning once when she was a child and later to complete her college education. So it was China that she knew growing up, assimilating its cultures, its values, and wisdom. Her only knowledge of America was her mother's fervent homesick patriotism. And when she finally returned to America in the 1930s, she was astonished. She thought she was coming to the land of the free and the home of the brave, and she found instead racist and inequitable treatment for women in a nation that she had come to believe was the land of the free. She wrote a collection of essays called Of Men and Women, and said when she returned to America, she, quote, expected to find men and women really equal. That is, that the affairs of the nation, large and small, were carried on by both alike. She went on to say in that essay that, much to her surprise, where she expected a free society, she found that, quote, women's influence is almost totally lacking in the centers of American life. One of the earliest causes that Buck advocated for publicly was women's equality and opportunity. According to the paper on the website of Randolph-Macon College, that of course is her alma mater, Pearl was not so much a spokesperson for the women's movement, but an advocate through pen and paper. Regardless, she was clearly a national voice for the women's movement. In 1960, according to her biographer, Peter Kahn, she was approached by the Norton Publishing Company about a worthiness of a manuscript which they had received, and they said, if you do not approve this, we will not publish it. The manuscript was The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. As according to womenshistory.com, the book that started the women's movement. Today, the women's movement is led, the voice is Terry O'Neill. In 1960, it was Pearl Buck. The women's equality was not the first issue she was known for, however. With the publication of her novels in the early 1930s, she quickly became an unofficial, I want to make that clear, she was an unofficial spokesperson for all things Asian. And she worked to promote cross-cultural understanding between Asian and the Western world. Her best-selling novel, The Good Earth, was read by millions of Americans. And for many, It was the only understanding that Americans had of China and the East. Indeed, near the end of the decade, as America approached war with Japan, making China our ally, for Japan had already invaded China, a poll was taken of Americans, this was 1938, asking what Americans knew about China. 90% said the only thing they knew about China was what they had read in Pearl Buck's books. Harold Isaacs stated that the good earth influenced American views of China, quote, in a way that could never be accomplished by event or propaganda. By 1941, Pearl and her second husband, Richard Walsh, were active in almost all of America's non-governmental dealings with China, according to Peter Kahn. Earlier that year, they had formed the East-West Association, dedicated to help ordinary people on one side of the world know and understand ordinary people on the other. Both Pearl and her husband were active in the China Emergency Relief Committee and the United China Relief, organizations that provided humanitarian relief to China as it experienced Japanese aggression. It's interesting to note to me that Pearl and Richard's work during the war were efforts of humanitarian aid to work for peace. Pearl was a prominent pacifist, as her family had been before her. There's a wonderful story in Hillsborough about her family not supporting either side in the Civil War. And so here's this advocate of peace that spends her entire life embroiled in war. Perhaps it was the fact she personally witnessed war and unrest as a child, and her pacifist family influenced her, but she became a leading spokesperson for peace in America during World War II at a time when pacifism was not considered patriotic. And so she was imprisoned for that. According to the bio printed on the Pearl S. Buck International website, quote, she was a longtime advocate of cross-cultural understanding and racial harmony as a means of achieving world peace. In addition to providing humanitarian aid to China, Pearl and her husband worked to change the political climate in America. They established the Citizens to Repeal Chinese Exclusion with Richard as its chairman. Pearl had been dismayed to learn that since the 1880s, American law excluded any Chinese immigration. Now, how we got those railroads built, I don't know. But that it was illegal for a Chinese person to come into this nation. And despite harassments and accusations, Pearl testified before the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization, urging a repeal of this inequitable system. Finally, in October 1943, after 60 years of discrimination, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. And I was interested to note a speaker from the Pearl S. Buck International this morning said that the first Chinese in America after this Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed was the second wife of Lossing Buck. I just thought that was a fascinating little tidbit. It's clear, Pearl Buck was considered to be an authority on all things Asian. And one example of this, just 4 weeks after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Pearl was invited to the White House to preside over a remarkable gathering of Chinese and American officials who wanted to hear what she had to say about the Japanese and the Asian War. Her audience included notables such as Wild Bill Donovan, the leader of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, Chinese Ambassador Hu Shi, Chinese Foreign Minister T.V. Soong, and press officer to President Roosevelt, Lowell Mellett. It was even suggested by Clifton Fadiman that Pearl be named to ambassador to China, saying she earned the job. As a side note, she knew more about China than the current American intelligence agency. So she cleared, and they came to her for advice. What do? We are now allies with China. How do we handle this? But Pearl's viewpoints were not always compatible with the government. In 1942, Pearl collected 10 of her articles and speeches on civil rights and international politics and published them in a book called American Unity and Asia. One of these essays bravely condemned the internment of Japanese Americans. Not many individuals in this nation spoke out against President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which directed the War Department to identify potentially treacherous persons and place them in military confinement. But Pearl would not be deterred by public fear, and her essays stirred up both fervent opposition and support. The FBI called it sabotage. The New York Times called it magnificent. In addition to speaking out for liberation for Japanese Americans, she took the controversial stand in advocating independence from India, from Great Britain. She condemned Britain's control of India, and in particular, Winston Churchill's racism. She adamantly maintained the war offered America the opportunity to insist on the end of white rule in India. By the end of, and this is a quote from Peter Kahn, by the end of 1942, it was Pearl Buck, not Franklin Roosevelt or any politician, who became the leading spokesperson for Indian liberation. But it was the fight for civil rights and equality for African Americans that was probably nearest to her heart. She spoke passionately about the need to end racism. Her own experience in China made her understand what it was like to be treated differently because of the color of your skin. She had grown up a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl in a brown-skinned country. It would profoundly affect her for the rest of her life. During the war years of America, Pearl quickly became the most outspoken and tenacious opponent of discrimination. At her instigation, the American Civil Liberties Union established the Committee Against Racial Discrimination and appointed her chair. The committee lobbied for equal employment, a federal anti-lynching law, abolition of the poll tax, and elimination of segregation in the military. None of these objectives were achieved during the war, but they were achieved after the war in many cases. And it was Pearl's tireless efforts that led her to be hailed by poet Langston Hughes as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of the 20th century. Indeed, racial tension was high both on the home front and the military. At the beginning of the war, African Americans were isolated and politically voiceless. According to historian David Kennedy, the United States Armed Forces deliberately replicated patterns of civilian society by confining black troops to segregated units, assigning them to non-combat and demeaning construction duty. While President Roosevelt did enact Order 8802 that prevented discrimination in employment in America, he greatly disappointed black leaders when he refused to segregate the armed forces. Pearl spoke to African Americans to fight for equality in the military. In a commencement address at Howard University in 1942, she asked African Americans to support the war only on the condition that the U.S. government recognized the aspiration of black Americans for equality. And she encouraged them to join with other non-white nations in a larger struggle for freedom. She went so far to say in a later speech, if we persist in discriminating against blacks, we're fighting on the wrong side of this war. We belong with Hitler. Strong statement. Needless to say, this was not popular with many people in America. The FBI had already begun to keep an eye on Pearl and now became more aggressive in its surveillance, that is according to Peter Kahn. By the spring of 1943, she came to the attention of the House Un-American Activities Committee. That committee had been established in 1938 to investigate allegations of communist activity in the U.S. Pearl was not a communist. She was most definitely not a communist. But she did not support the purportedly democratic leader Chiang Kai-shek. She knew firsthand he was inefficient and corrupt. Worse, he did not consider the needs of millions of peasants in his land. And she warned that Mao Zedong and his Red Army did appreciate the peasants in China, and that the American government should keep those lines of communication open because he would eventually control China. Of course, the events following the war confirmed her worst fears. The communist revolution put Mao in power, and the Red Curtain fell, cutting off communication with China. And these events had an adverse effect on Pearl Buck. According to Peter Kahn, Pearl's place in the arena of American politics would change considerably after the war. For one thing, the war was over, and Japan defeated, Asia was no longer news. For another, the loss of China, a myth perpetrated by opponents of Truman, and the fear of communism would cause panic and the witch hunt-like trials of the McCarthy era. Pearl's association with China would damage her reputation. As Peter Kahn puts it, she would watch herself erased from literary history as the academic canon was defined in the post-war years. Didn't matter, Pearl didn't stop. Despite this, she continued to fight for change. After World War II, the project she threw herself into was, of course, the love of children, which we've heard quite a lot about here today already. But I will go on to say, according to the Pearl S. Buck International site, they say, quote, in 1949, when she became aware of the immense problem of mixed-race children, Pearl Buck and her friend in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, founded the Welcome House Adoption Agency, which continues today. And I think it's interesting to note, it is not only biracial children that she sought to place in loving homes. She sought to find a home for any child considered unadoptable. Sibling groups, children with special needs, older children. If a child was not adoptable, that's the one that she took into Welcome House. And then later she founded Pearl S. Buck Foundation, which of course has become international, to sponsor the adoptions of biracial children in Asia. And she and her husband also put their money where their mouth is, as you might hear me say later, and they adopted 7 more children and served as foster parents for 3 more after that. It was probably her own personal tragedy that fueled Pearl's passion to help children. Pearl's only biological child, Carol, was a special needs child, and Pearl longed for more children and filled that need by creating agencies and adopting her own. But Carol's condition brought another humanitarian cause for which Pearl fought. In the mid-19th century, it was social taboo to talk about your retarded child. Martha Jablow, in her foreword to the book, the recent reprint of the book, The Child That Never Grew, states, Pearl was the first prominent person to acknowledge publicly a child with mental retardation. Following the book's publication, Pearl received many, many letters from grateful parents, physicians, and public health authorities telling her what a difference she had made in the social acceptance of special needs children. She never stopped working for social causes that were her passion. Even at the end of her life, she continued to speak against the Vietnam War, and she's going to speak against nuclear disarmament. She was clearly a woman ahead of her time. Peter Kahn states, quote, she had achieved an influence that was unusual by any measure and especially rare for a woman. Her values of equality, racial harmony, and world peace are exemplary by contemporary standards of today. But in the turbulent years of World War II and the Cold War, those values resulted in serious denunciation and criticism. Pearl Buck's belief in racial and gender equality, the importance of world peace may not have been shared by all people in the mid-19th century, but they're commonly held today. Perhaps the perspective of a new century will allow us to reevaluate Pearl Buck's place in American history as an activist and a force for social change. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We now have about 12, 13 minutes to entertain any questions or comments for any of the panelists. What we'll do is I'll take your questions from the audience. I'll repeat those questions for the camera, and then I'll ask to whomever the question was addressed to come up front to answer that. So do we have any questions or comments for any of the presentations, any of the panelists? Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question for TK. So South Korea is now becoming more accepting of multicultural children and seeing itself as a multicultural society. So is it as accepting then of people whose heritage is not originally South Korean? I mean, maybe they're Chinese, or maybe they're South Asian, etc. They may not be bicultural, but they are by heritage from some other culture, although they were born in South Korea and such. Are they accepting of everyone now, or is there still some questionable areas?
Okay, the question from Mr. Park is, now that South Korea is more accepting of multicultural children or mixed racial children or children of different cultures, is that more prevalent in South Korea now than it has been?
Well, definitely. But I should emphasize what that's basically, multiculturalism, the principle of multicultural, accepting, foreign people and mixed children, ethnically mixed children as regular members of the society. I mean, this idea was perpetuated by the government as a policy, but the popular opinion is a different matter. And Korea has become a member of the so-called OECD country. So it should, somehow honor, the principles of, non-racial discrimination, which are universally adopted, by advanced countries. So, today, especially, when the progressive forces actually took the presidency from 1998 all the way to 2008, a lot of reforms were made. So the Korean government actually created a special ministry called the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, because discriminations against women were also very severe. So they created the special ministry, and also they created also as I told you the Center for Multicultural Families and so on. That's a government policy, but as I look at some of the opinions are available on website. What popular opinion is still pretty much against mixed people, and but basically what I'm saying, why Paul Buck should be regarded as the kind of a pioneer of multiculturalism is because simply there was no individual in South Korea who worked for their principle in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even until the 1990s. So, but this practice of I had not known actually until last summer, and probably I guess a lot of Koreans and Americans who do not know about this fact. So, yeah, but in principle, the government still supports. Doesn't matter whether conservative forces or progressive forces. This is an adopted policy. Why? Because as I told you, demographic problems, economic problems, pretty clear. So, without accepting, foreign immigrants, this country may not survive in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Melanie.
So I talked about this when we had the ceremony for the transfer of the papers, in that I consider myself a feminist, a liberal person, and when J. Cole called me to be on this committee, I had to Google Pearl S. Buck, right? And so what are people's ideas to get her more in front of the current generation of children, of young adults, so that people do read her activism, and she's so far ahead of her time, and has things that are so relevant to all of the problems that we're facing today? What are people's ideas of how we can do that?
Okay, so the question or the comment on the floor is Pearl was a very strong feminist, a very strong proponent of women's rights, but she's relatively unknown in today's society. So what are people doing? What ideas are there out there to bring her back into the collective consciousness of this society? Anyone have any comment? Yes, ma'am.
Ann Kaler, Dr. Kaler, was one of the founders of the Middle Atlantic Popular Cultural Association, one of the original members of that. And with her retirement and coming up to Pearl Buck and trying to get Pearl Buck out there, we have started going to all the conferences. So we have been to probably the last 8 years with topics on Pearl S. Buck, trying to reach all the college teachers and different areas there to get her known. And then what we're also offering at the International Writing Center.
Thank you. Comment here.
I'm one of those women too, like you, and I'm going to do my talk tomorrow morning kind of about my experience with that, but I wonder about the library system. I know you're doing the things in schools which you talked about, which I think is really fabulous. And I think the West Virginia Writers does a Pearl Buck contest too. But I wonder about the library system, if she couldn't be more honored in libraries in West Virginia in particular, as this amazing West Virginia.
I
Thank
think
you.
she is honored in West Virginia libraries. I think it's outside of West Virginia and in eastern Pennsylvania that we've got to work on getting her done.
Okay,
Well, I'm
thank
in
you.
West Virginia.
Yes, ma'am, here.
I read her book, The Good Earth, when I was in 7th grade. And I went to China 15 15 years ago next month to adopt a baby girl from China, my niece. So I bought 2 books, The Good Earth, and I'm going to order the children's books, and I'm going to give them to Julia, who is the adopted, and then I'm going to give them to my 11th grade granddaughter, and then my 11-year-old and 9-year-old. So I think we can each, put that little pebble in the stream and let it go.
Yeah, I did ask my 17-year-old granddaughter, who lives in West Virginia. She's a straight A student. She had not heard of Pearl Buck or The Good Earth, so she did go ask her English teacher for it. She's been carrying it around with her, though she's read it yet.
Okay.
If she
Yes,
took
ma'am.
West Virginia history, she should have heard of her.
Well, maybe
No,
she
they don't teach her.
They don't teach her anymore. That's to Melanie's point, one of the things we're trying to do with this advisory committee is to get her back into the school systems in West Virginia. They should teach not only her contributions to literature, but her contributions to society in general. And that should be, if nowhere else, in the West Virginia history year, and that's 8th grade in the year of the Golden Horseshoe Test. So, yes, ma'am.
Perhaps you need to talk with the West Virginia Department of Education when they publish. I'm a 4th grade teacher, was a 4th grade teacher, but when they publish each year, we have our content standards that are published by the FAB, and the teachers look at the standards, and there are certain people in certain areas in social studies and history that have to be covered, and she is not on that list, and perhaps she needs to be added at the state level for those content standards.
Jay and Melanie, are you taking notes? Okay. Yes, ma'am, right
And
here.
the same issue in Pennsylvania. We've established an educational program where we invite the neighborhood schools in. It's accelerating. We satisfy the standards in Pennsylvania, and we're on many of the sites now. And the visitation by our local school children has really increased. And the most gratifying thing is, when the children have finished their tour, I've got to bring my parents in to see this. They are so excited about Pearl Buck.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say that we are offering 12 different classes next year for the Writing Center, and that's 58 different events. We'll have contests, writing contests also for adults and children. And I didn't know, we are also publishing there now, so you'll be able to get any of our new works and such there. But we're also publishing, Mr. Park, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the short story that she wrote to the children's story that she wrote to publicize Korean and Amerasian adoptions. So that will be, we hope, ready in October.
And you're speaking from where?
Pearl Buck International Writing Center in Percy,
Percy, yeah.
Pennsylvania.
Okay, Carol, did you have?
Right, the absence of Pearl Buck from academic curricula is a long-standing one. I mean, Peter Kahn writes about that in his biography of her, that at the time he was writing it, well, the years before 1996 when it was published, there wasn't one college curriculum in the nation in American literature, course in America, that included the writings of Pearl Buck. So, I mean, that's a place where we have to begin as well. And the high school students these days are not reading The Good Earth. It used to be a kind of standard choice for 10th graders, let's say.
Or an AP.
Yes, but they're not reading it. So you say that name in a class, and they do not recognize it at all. The students do not recognize it. So any outreach that can be done by Pearl Buck International, the school districts in West Virginia, wherever, will help, full attention.
I was going to say very quickly that Pearl was done such a disservice by the male critics
Yes.
After The Good Earth. I mean, short story, she's a chick writer. Who cares about China? We're never going to have anything to do with China. And if she can win the Nobel, anybody can. And it was all led by Robert Frost,
Well, among others.
among others. But he was the leader. And Theodore Dreiser.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, and you can come to me in person. Julia, in the 6th grade, would stop going to school. Aunt Judy, would you help us? She won't go to school. I got a ticket driving fast to get there that morning. She wouldn't get out of bed. So, blah, 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 blah. So I stay a few days. At the end of her 6th grade year, 2 of her girlfriends, came up to my niece and said, "We want to tell you, the teacher told us not to be friends with Julia because she was Chinese."
Oh, my goodness.
So if you have,
Okay. Hopefully someone will talk with you. Anything else? Any other comments or questions for the presenters? All right, we're going to adjourn this session. Thank you all very much for coming.